And now let's talk about ties between India and Ukraine. They haven't been great, especially lately, particularly since Russia began the war. Why? Because India has not completely rallied behind Ukraine. And don't get me wrong, New Delhi is not supporting the brutal war. Prime Minister Narendra Modi told Russian President Putin that this is not the era for war. India is pushing for a diplomatic solution. But Kyiv has been critical of India. Listen to what their foreign minister said just a few months ago.
You can enjoy the benefit of buying cheap Russian oil because someone in Ukraine is dying because of the Russian aggression.
They're upset because India buys Russian oil. Ukraine says India is bankrolling the Russian war machine. Never mind the fact that India must look after its own economic interests, or that Europe was buying oil and more from Russia. The numbers speak for themselves. Ukraine's criticism was reserved only for India. It offered moral lectures for months on end. Now suddenly the tone has changed. Ukraine says it is in no position to instruct India, and it's seeking humanitarian aid. So what happened? Is it a change of heart or a change of circumstances? There's no doubt that Ukraine needs help. It is not making gains on the battlefield. This week, their deputy foreign minister is in India. Her name is Amin Zaparova. She's on a 4-day official visit and seems to have come with an olive branch and an agenda. Listen to what she said on Monday.
I think that India, as a global player, really is a Vishwaguru of the world. And this is what we also feel in Ukraine by actually fighting for the values. This is about justice.
Vishwaguru. It roughly translates to global teacher or guide. It's what India aims to be. So unless she's mocking India, this was high praise coming from Ukraine. And a stark departure from the comments of her boss, Ukraine's foreign minister, Dmitry Kuleba. He slammed India and India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar for reminding the world that Europe too buys Russian oil. He said the oil India buys from Russia contains the blood of Ukrainians. So why is his deputy doing this about turn? Because Ukraine wants something. Two somethings, actually. One relates to the upcoming G20 summit in India.
Ukrainian agenda is something that impacts the whole world because it's a litmus paper that shows all of the drawbacks and flaws of the international system and incapability to protect sovereign countries whenever it's attacked by a stronger one. So I think that India may take also this leadership by involving and engaging Ukrainian agenda into discussions that would take place at the side events or sidelines or the events dedicated to the G20 or within summits of G20.
Zelensky wants to speak at the G20 meeting that will be held in India in the month of September, like he did last year when Indonesia hosted the summit in Bali. But India may have other plans. New Delhi has not publicly spoken about Zelensky's request. Reports say India wants to focus on global economic challenges, and it doesn't want the meeting to be hijacked by Ukraine. It happened the last time, with the West on one side and Russia and China on the other. So this time, Zelensky may not get a global platform. What's the second thing that Kyiv wants from New Delhi? Symbolic visits, apparently. Ukraine wants Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi to visit the country, to take a walk through the capital like his European counterparts keep doing. The wish may not be granted, given India's ties with Russia. These ties go back to the old Soviet Union days, so an Indian Prime Minister visiting Ukraine at this time sounds like a pipe dream, and Kyiv probably realizes this too, so it has proposed another name.
Ukrainian people are now experts in international relations. They closely watch the comments of different leaders, as well as the Prime Minister Modi, the travels of the National Security Advisor, Mr. Doval, and when he 3 times go to Moscow, of course, it's a matter of question if he would come to Kyiv, and we also will be happy to welcome leaders and officials of India in Kyiv, just to balance and just to kind of demonstrate pragmatic approach.
Ukraine says it wants India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval to visit as a sign of balance. It's a strange request, but then again, the war has shown that optics matter. New Delhi will have to take a call on whether this makes sense for India. There are other requests that Kyiv has made, like more Indian medical supplies and the kind of stuff that Foreign Minister Kuleba does not talk about when he targets India. India has been providing Ukraine with medicines and medical equipment since the war began. This is a show of solidarity for those affected by the violence. It's a humanitarian form of support. There's also a letter from President Zelensky addressed to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Its contents have not been made public yet, but it's reportedly a request for more aid from India. And all of this marks a shift in the stance of Kyiv. Pushed to the wall, it is working to mend ties with India instead of being confrontational. It's a step in the right direction, of course. We're waiting to see how India responds. Tonight we start with the economy. There's good news and bad news. The bad news is that global growth is slowing down. The good news is it's not as bad as the world feared. And the best news is that India remains the bright spot. A new assessment has come out. It's from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. It has slashed the global growth outlook. The forecast for leading economies looks grim. The UK is among the worst performing. Their economy is shrinking. In Germany, there may be a recession, but India remains strong. The IMF has a lot to say about India. In fact, let me quote from what one official said. Yes, we have a growth rate for India, which is 6.8 in 2022. Let's not forget, this is one of the bright spots in the global economy right now. So what is India's growth forecast this time? 5.9%. The IMF says the Indian economy will grow by 5.9%. And this is a downgrade compared to the last assessment. The last one came in the month of January. That was 3 months back. Then the IMF said that India will grow at a rate of 6.1%. So in these 3 months, the forecast for India has been slashed by 0.2%. And yet, India remains the fastest growing economy in the world. Listen to this.
What's happening here is also a set of historical revisions. We realized that 2020, 2021 has been actually a lot better than we thought. And so actually there's less room for catching up. And that pent-up demand, which from consumption that was informing our previous forecast, is therefore going to be less because they've already had more catching up before. So that's why there's the downward revision this year. Then we go up to 6.3 next year. Again, a very strong economy, which is necessary to allow India to continue to converge towards higher living standards and create those jobs.
So 5.9% growth this year and 6.3% in the next financial year. That's the growth trajectory for India according to the IMF. It's lower than India's own growth forecast, but it's pretty solid when you look at the rest of the world. According to the IMF, the United States will grow at a rate of 1.6%. The Eurozone, 0.8%. Eurozone has 19 countries which use the euro as their currency. Russia's growth is projected to be 0.7% despite the war and the Western sanctions. China 5.2% and India 5.9%. So India comes on top of this list. Why do you think India is doing better? The World Bank has an assessment. This came out earlier this month. And here is what the World Bank said about India. I'm quoting again. The Indian economy continues to show strong resilience to external shocks. Notwithstanding external pressures, India's service exports have continued to increase and the current account deficit is narrowing. So there are 3 reasons. The Indian economy is not as exposed to external shocks as the rest. The rising exports have helped, and India has a narrowing current account deficit. What's a current account deficit? It's the difference between a government's expenses and earnings. Let me rephrase this. India is doing better because of immunity to external shocks, expanding exports, and reducing deficits. And the numbers support this assessment. Last month, India's exports crossed the 750 billion mark. This was an all-time high. Inflation is slowly coming under control. In February, inflation in India fell below the 7% mark. This year's monsoon predictions are out. Forecasters say India will have a normal monsoon this year. This is expected to boost food grain output and ease concerns of any shortage. Since the pandemic began, the Indian economy has performed better than the rest. The challenge now is to sustain this growth, to keep it at the same level. And it won't be easy because while India can resist some of the external shocks, it cannot avoid them altogether. And there will be external shocks. The IMF says the outlook for the world economy remains dim.
We have a global slowdown in growth, not just for advanced economies, but also for emerging market and developing economies. We are in a situation where there is elevated levels of nervousness in the market. There are a number of vulnerabilities out there, and one should be very vigilant going ahead to try to make sure that The places that look weak are reinforced or buttressed or taking actions to reduce these vulnerabilities.
What are these vulnerabilities? High inflation, rising interest rates, the uncertainty in the global banking sector, which was triggered by the bank failures in the US, and the war in Ukraine. It has cast a shadow on the economy. Policymakers and investors are nervous. The war is far from over, and there's a fear that it may spill over. There are growing geopolitical tensions over Ukraine, so the global economic situation remains challenging, and India's policy planners have their task cut out. They must create new opportunities and contain the risks. Right now, India's finance minister is in Washington. Nirmala Sitharaman is leading a high-powered delegation and meeting top officials. Yesterday, she met with Geeta Gopinath, the deputy managing director of IMF. They discussed global economic challenges. Sitharaman also met Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, their finance minister. India is pushing for reforms of multilateral development banks, like the World Bank. Yellen has appreciated India's stance on the issue. The next few months are going to be crucial. As the world's fastest growing economy, there will be more expectations from India, and New Delhi will have to go beyond expressing opinion. It will have to come up with solutions to some of the most pressing challenges of the world today. Time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with the US. A major wildfire broke out in New Jersey. Only about 10% of the fire has been contained. In Colombia, a volcano is on the verge of erupting. Authorities say the volcano is unstable and there is an increased seismic activity. Parts of Syria are flooded. It is getting difficult for children to reach their schools. And now, what makes April the 12th a significant day? Let's take you back in history. On this day, the first ever human went to space. The year was 1961. Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit the Earth. The flight lasted 108 minutes. With this, the era of human space flight began, and the Soviet Union beat the US to it. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.